Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Jonson Porteux, assistant professor at Kansai Gaidai University in Osaka, Japan, and author of a number of interesting studies on the nature of the Korean mafia. Now, just as in many other countries around the world, Korean society is in many ways fascinated by its mafia element. There's countless movies that come out every single year on this topic. They speak about a shadowy underworld that many people don't see, and they talk about a romanticized past, a different idea of Korea, a growing nation, and a hole inside that the mafia filled. It's always an image of terror and intrigue and fascination, and one that doesn't seem to be dying out in Korea today. But there is a much deeper history to all of this, and a much more nuanced understanding of just what role the mafia has filled in the development of the Korean state from its very early beginnings in the Goryeo dynasty, where a series of itinerant peddlers were looking for protection. They banded together against predation from the upper elite classes. As this pushes forward into the Joseon dynasty, these same groups are now working in many ways with the state. They are fulfilling roles the state cannot do themselves, such as gathering information, they are running tax collection, and in some ways, they are an important element in all forms of armed conflict for the state itself. But in 1910, Japan put an end to all of this. They annexed Korea, of course, with the intention of dominating the peninsula. And in this, powerful elements cannot be allowed to run free. So the Korean mafia at this time collapses into a period of hibernation. There's no space in the state for it to run. And then, of course, in 1945, that space is reopened for them. Japan loses the Second World War. The Korean peninsula is liberated. And what is left behind, in many ways, is the complete absence of a state. The basic desires of everyday people just cannot be met by a government that doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the institutions, and doesn't have the reach to do it for them. So the mafia element returns, and it returns in a new capacity. They are now state builders. In many ways, they become responsible for the embryonic growth of Korean society. But as history tends to run in a roller coaster fashion, so the mafia finds itself again being pushed increasingly into the shadows. Park Chung-hee's military uprising, military coup, brings with it a commitment to suffocate these groups and to eradicate them from society. Where Park Chung-hee kicked this off, Chun Doo-won quickly follows on after Park's assassination. Increasingly free range in police and military powers under martial law at this time gives the police the ability to further crack down on these groups. But it also breeds a new element. Through this free reign, many police officers develop relationships with these mafia elements themselves. And where these mafia groups were once marginalized, they find new avenues to exploit. Previously restricted areas of entertainment are opened up, and the mafia fill this void very quickly. Beyond this, they return to state building, and they play an important role in the massive construction efforts and redevelopment that has gone on around Korea in the late 80s, early 90s. And this rolls us forward to the modern nature of the Korean mafia, how it currently exists, and the important work that Jonson Porteux has done here. Whereas most academic studies are done in the library, in quiet study halls, Porteux managed to do something different. He managed to find a way inside the Korean mafia and spent a year of his life living, breathing, drinking with these people. The insights he gained and the research he conducted formed the basis for his PhD and for a series of other subsequent works. And, of course, it is also the basis of today's podcast. This is a unique look inside a shadowy organization. A look that is very hard to acquire without the important works of Jonson Porteux. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast and you want it to continue, please consider donating in some capacity at the Patreon account attached to this podcast, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. So, without any further delay, this is Jonson Porteux. Jonson Porteux, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. So today we're going to be talking about the Korean mafia, and you have a unique experience inside this group, but we might wind things right back to how you first got there. So there's this idea about the beginnings of all mafia organizations, not just the Korean mafia, which we'll come to in a second, but also the Yakuza and the Sicilian mafia, that they come about at a time when the feudal system is breaking down or failing. That to actually study the Korean mafia, you need to study state development and state weakness.
Yeah, so if you look at the very kind of definition of what a state is, usually we start with kind of a classic Weberian definition, which is an entity, and I'm paraphrasing here. It's an entity with a monopoly or near monopoly over the means and use of legitimate violence within a given territory. So the very definition of a state has to do with violence. And you see essentially all states beginning as quasi mafia type organizations where the main thing that they sell is basically protection. And people are paying for protection from other groups, but they're also paying the main group for protection against itself. So it's a protection racket. And we see the development of states is through this kind of evolutionary process. And then what we have now, for example, the United States or South Korea or Japan, are considered legitimate, and everybody that's outside of that is then considered illegitimate or illegal. And that's what I was dealing with is kind of this evolution and how these entities evolve over time.
Sure. So let's move in straight to the Korean context here, and let's go back as far as we can here. So to the Goryeo dynasty. So this is AD 918 to 1392, this sort of period. And this is when it all really begins for the Korean mafia and Korean organized crime. And it starts with these itinerant bands of Korean peddlers searching for protection from the higher classes.
Yeah. So you have these itinerant peddlers, which is kind of interesting because that's similar to the case of Japan. In Korea, they had bubosang, and there's a number of ways to pronounce it, but that's the way that I've heard it. And in Japan, you had tekiya. And what's interesting is you would have the state rely on these itinerant peddlers for things like tax collection, and also for things like gathering information. And so the state would begin to utilize them in areas where its capacity was weakest, or its reach was weakest, or power was the most vague. And so you had this kind of interesting relationship develop between the state and these non-state groups. And when the Japanese colonial period began, unofficially 1905, officially annexed 1910, one of the first things that the colonial government did was to stamp out this organization because it did represent, or at least there was the potential for some kind of organized opposition. And I think probably the Japanese had learned about these, certainly about the existence of tekiya in Japan and how they had become a source of non-state violence, which would be a threat to their own legitimacy.
And of course, in that period before the Japanese stamped this out, because of course they're trying to dominate the peninsula as thoroughly as possible, these groups had moved from people seeking their own protection from higher classes, from feudal lords, etc., to becoming groups that were in cahoots, in a sense. They were doing things like help. They were quasi-tax collectors. They were spying. They were gathering information. They were scouting. They were, in some ways, working for the state as well as themselves.
Yeah, well, they were certainly subservient to the state. So a kind of a junior partner in a way. And so in return for the state tolerating or allowing certain types of activities, they performed these services. So it was a somewhat symbiotic or a mutualistic relationship. And we've seen this type of relationship, of course, in the past and also in the present. And it's important that this is not just in Korea or in Japan. This is fairly commonplace, fairly ubiquitous. And a lot of it, you see these relationships, especially when you're dealing with violence in areas where the state is not present or is weakest.
So that brings us forward a little bit here. So in 1910, Japan annexed the peninsula and they clear out a lot of these organized crime. They stamp down on it as much as possible. But of course, in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, Korea is now liberated of sorts. The Japanese leave, and once again, it's collapsed into this period of statelessness. This sort of state that's situation that's primed for the re-emergence of these groups.
Yeah. So that was very much, it was a stateless territory, and you had a number of state seekers. So you didn't have any one group which had a monopoly over the means and use of violence. And so you had groups, and they were forming, and they were looking to somehow shape the trajectory of the future of Korea, and that was a period of unorganized violence, which is very, very dangerous, very, very unpredictable.
And sorry, go.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
And also at this period, there's a absence of economic prosperity. So of course, Japan have been defeated. They have left the peninsula, but in the same sense, Korea has lost their number one trading partner. They've lost a lot of the industry that they've had. They lost their war economy, and the country is desperately poor at this time.
Yeah, and you had this also. What was going on at that time was this ideological battle going on between, principally the focused on the United States and the Soviet Union at that time. People were looking at communism as or heavy socialism as a legitimate option, and you had and so they were naturally leftist, and so you had the majority in the peninsula who might have been inclined towards this potentially this communist ideal, and you had a minority in the among the rightists, those that were slightly more inclined towards a capitalist model. And so it was very difficult early on for the Americans in the South to establish their control. And because they were weak, you had these groups that were constantly challenging each other, this rightist leftist divide, and it ultimately culminated into U.S. forces going, expanding and utilizing sometimes refugees coming down from the north. So those that had these more rightist inclinations voting with their feet coming down to the south, and those that had these leftist inclinations either battling in the south or walking up to the north. So life was quite precarious. And fairly violent, just like Hobbes mentioning that life in nature is short, nasty, and brutish. That's very much how Korea was. So what is the solution to that? Well, that's the development of government and civil society, and that requires having this control and inducing capacity to induce people to follow your will. And finally, the United States was able to do that in part by bringing in people like Kim Gu and Lee Seung-man. And then you had 1948 was that period. And then you had, of course, the Korean War after that.
So that's an important point just to touch on there. So during this period, there's this absence of any real state. And these groups from poverty or from desire have filled this gap in, so to speak. But then they form a unique alliance with the political class. And this is where a term that you bring up a few times, and it's been used before, this idea of the rise of the political gangster.
Yeah, so you have the political gangster, and of course they're utilizing violence in order to establish their supremacy, their superiority, and in the early periods of this process, they're going to have to use violence a lot more because people aren't oftentimes aware of how much power they actually have, and when they utilize it successfully, they stop having to utilize it as much. So things start to operate through the threat of violence, and we saw this process carried out. And so you had all these different political bosses with these different orientations, and through the help of the U.S. military forces, they were able to achieve that, the rightist in the southern part of the peninsula.
I suppose it's important here to mention it because you've mentioned America a couple of times in this, and just to show just how empty the space was of the Korean state and America's position there. They themselves came around to a position where they funded a particular militarist group simply to get things done. There was no other way to function inside Korean society at this time.
Yeah, so there's interesting reports. I was able to find some declassified reports by the counterintelligence corps, the U.S. counterintelligence corps, where they were utilizing then designated terrorist groups, this Northwest Young Men's Association, refugees from the North, who were known for using terrorist tactics and conspicuous violence. But in the reports, and I have these on my website, I had was able to obtain them, and I put them up on my website just so other people can also see this. Is they're admitting to using these groups. They're admitting to these violent groups, and they're useful. Whether they're sending them back up to the north for information or sending them to gather information from groups in the south or suppress any forms of opposition. They were utilized extensively in places like Jeju-do, in the Jeju-do massacre, where just some of the accounts are just so explicit and violent. It's quite amazing that they would even admit to this.
So for people listening, the Jeju-do massacre is a massacre of effectively communist elements in the southern island of Korea?
Well, certainly leftist elements. Mm-hmm. So it's the southernmost island. It's considered the Korea's Hawaii in a way. And I've seen estimates of up to 30,000 people. This is not based on my research. I'm quoting other people. But 30,000 people who had perished in those uprisings.
Now that's an important point to touch on here. So just before we move on past this period, this idea that these early Korean mafia groups are growing the state for when there is nothing there to exist. Just to mention that Jeju-do massacre there as well, that you write in one of your pieces here that the criminal groups operating during this period were fundamentally, overwhelmingly ideological. And this is not something you tend to think of for mafia groups. They tend to be focused on greed or power, but at this period, it's about ideology.
Well, it's kind of difficult to find out the actual motivations of let's say mafia-type groups or terrorist groups, whether it's greed or whether it's actual grievance. But for the most part, these groups were explicitly ideologically motivated, which would put them in the category of terrorist organizations, as opposed to economically oriented. And for the most part, the groups that I dealt with in modern Korea, or at least in 2010, 2011, and presently, are economically motivated. These ideological groups, it's actually would be a lot more dangerous for me to deal with them. And I think if I was dealing with these ideological motivated groups at that time, my research would have been much more dangerous. So oftentimes they're utilizing violence for symbolic reasons, as opposed to economically oriented groups, which have an interest in not utilizing violence. So anytime they have to utilize violence, some kind of breakdown has occurred.
Yeah, okay. And so I imagine in that situation, as long as you stay out of the way of a group that's motivated simply for economic gain, as long as you're not compromising their ability to make money, then you're relatively safe. But an ideological group, you become an open mark no matter what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, hurting me would be bad for business in terms of an economically motivated type mafia. For a terrorist type organization, hurting me might be might be costly in the short term, but that might be part of their longer term, fit into their longer term strategy.
So in 1948, Sungmin Rhee takes power. And then in 1961, he is removed, after a brief flirtation with democracy, just doesn't last very long. In 1961, Park Chung-hee takes power of the country. And this flips the script quite dramatically on the mafia groups. So one of the things he comes in and does is immediately tries to slamp down and cramp and suffocate these mafia organizations.
Yeah, so early on you had this kind of outsourcing in a way under a logic of capacity. So the state didn't have its own publicly sourced capacity early on, and so they would reach out and cooperate with these groups and bring them in, but they're still they have these horizontal relationships as opposed to vertically ordered, and Lee Sung-man was doing his best to bring all these horizontally oriented subcontracted groups under his umbrella, but then he was forced out. And then you had Park Chung-hee, who came in through coup d'etat. You have a military leader here. He's very adept at utilizing violence. He has, of course, the support of the military, of the police. And so he's going through and establishing his own supremacy. And he was able to do that to much greater effect or success than had Lee Sun-man before him. And you had these groups operating, sporadically. The state doesn't have perfect capacity everywhere. It can't perfectly eliminate it. But for the most part, when Park Chung-hee came in, it was the end of this political gangster period.
And what do you make of that change? Why do you believe this happened? Is this simply Park Chung-hee, because he came in via military coup, he has to make sure that the military is above all the strongest element inside society without any sort of question, and he sees these groups as a challenge to his authority? Is that it?
Yeah. So the thing about state development is it never ends. So it's almost like a newspaper or periodical. It continually has to reproduce its legitimacy. And having these outside groups operate, one, they represent a potential, a violent opposition or a source of violence that is not state sourced. And also, so there's that threat, and then also there is the fact that if these groups are operating, other people that are looking at the state will think, well, so why are these groups allowed to operate, or why can't the state eradicate them? And so they think, well, maybe the state is not so as effective as it could be. So the state wants to stamp them out and reduce them, and it continually has to reproduce again its legitimacy. And everything that state actors do now, for the most part, could be thought of as trying to reproduce the rationale for having them around, lest people start subscribing to some other option.
And what do you make of how he went about doing this? Of course, he comes to power through military coup, so he has an awful lot of leverage, awful lot of ability to do whatever he likes here. But almost immediately, in the days after he comes to power, he has 167 of these gangsters being paraded, of the high-level gangsters being paraded through the streets of Seoul. In a matter of weeks, he has 14,000 odd in prisons.
Yeah, so he was very effective, and a lot of these anti-crime campaigns were, I mean, of course, it was explicit, and they're parading them down the streets, and that's very much with intent to show people and look at, all right, you have this new leader coming in, and he's stamping out crime and is going to bring about stability, and those are often quite and were quite popular. And then you saw the same thing with Chun Do-hwan coming in following the assassination of Park Chung-hee, and even Chun Do-hwan was much more had a propensity to use violence, perhaps even more so than, or maybe he needed to, more than Park Chung-hee. And you had these different camps, Samcheong Kyukdae, these re-education camps began to emerge during that period.
So just to signpost this, though, Park Chung-hee is assassinated in 1979. Chun Do-hwan comes to power very soon after that. And it's almost immediately overshadowed. I mean, it's still a military coup, of course, but his rule is overshadowed almost immediately by the Gwangju uprising. Now, this is going to become important, this sort of democracy movements, for when we come to the current nature of the Korean movement. But it also gives him an awful lot of leverage, because Korean society right now is under martial law.
Yeah, under that period. So let me just signpost it myself. So early on, especially after you had the end of colonialism, and you had the state established by utilizing these non-state groups. So once they had served their purpose, especially under Park Chung-hee, these types of cooperative relationships ended, and so for the most part, you had violence under the state utilized by the state. So these non-state groups, for the most part, were eradicated in terms of the relationship, right? And in any kind of significant way. Then you had Park Chung-hee, who was assassinated 1979. You had the beginnings of the democracy movement, even under Lee Sun-man, but really rising towards the tail end of Park Chung-hee. And you had Chun Do-hwan, who followed Park Chung-hee, come in, and the Korea that he inherited was much more contentious in terms of those in favor of democracy and willing to exercise those demands or to protest, to come out and pay the cost. And so you had this period of chaos under Lee Sun-man, and then relative stability under Park Chung-hee, and then again back into chaos following Park Chung-hee's assassination.
And you mentioned at the very beginning of our discussion here this idea that the state operates in some ways like a mafia organization or vice versa. And that at least for me personally, it sounds from what Chun Do-hwan was trying to do at this period, awfully like a mafia organization. So in a sense, he's trying to strike a certain amount of terror into the hearts of the people inside his society, trying to strike a certain amount of fear into them, at the same time trying to please them, trying to acquire their favor, and say, as long as you behave in the right way, I will be your friend. But underscoring the whole enterprise seems to be this massive current of fear.
Yeah, so I want to kind of clarify that the main commodity sold by the state is protection, which is also the main commodity sold by mafia-type groups. So the difference there would be, how are they viewed in terms of legitimacy, which is kind of when you use it in that sense, it's more normative than a positive sense. And then you think, so what is the main difference between the South Korean government now, or the U.S. government, or Japanese government, and a mafia-type group or a kleptocracy? Well, the main difference is the political regime. So now you have a mafia-type group operating under a democratic regime. So they have to alter some of their practices. So I just kind of want to just clarify that point. But you have Chun Do-hwan, he's coming in, and it's chaotic, and of course he has to establish his supremacy, his rule, and part of that is through violence. But it's not all violence. They will often play a mixed strategy. And so one of those strategies that they played was to round up all of these potential opposition criminals, parade them down, similar to what Park Chung-hee had done, suppress any kind of contention, and then also pay off some of the key supporters or potential supporters, and those were, for the most part, a growing middle class. So under Park Chung-hee, he was able to establish Korea Incorporated in part. So with industrialization, you had the rising middle class, and they were looking for, their preferences were changing over time in favor of democracy, but also they have increasing consumption capacity. And Park Chung-hee started various development projects, which were popular, improving or introducing new infrastructure, removing shanty towns, providing new housing, having various international sporting events. And he also brought in something, the three S's. So screen in terms of film, sex in terms of kind of the entertainment industry, and de facto legalized or tolerated prostitution or varying types of adult entertainment, and then sports. So this introduction of sports and baseball as a way to placate or pay off key areas of society.
So what it sounds like you're hinting at there a little bit is that despite this massive crackdown, there's also a space opening up for these gangsters. And from what you've written here, it seems to be the case that by giving police so much free rein to arrest gangsters, 40-odd thousand were sent to these re-education camps during this period. And by giving the police such free rein, and of course during this period of martial law, that they also managed to create some unique relationships with the gangsters themselves, with these crime organizations.
Yeah, and so that's actually one area that in my dissertation, some of my findings that I wasn't able to include because it was very difficult. These kind of cooperative relationships, and one of the reasons why I couldn't include it was because I couldn't isolate the causality. Was it corruption that was causing this cooperation, or was it a lack of capacity? So I left it out. But that's a big aspect in if you're in Seoul or outside of Seoul. You have these entertainment districts where they have a lot of bars and room salons and arcades. And a lot of that is controlled and operated by these criminal organizations. And again, you have this shift. So these organizations, for the most part, would not be considered, they're certainly economically motivated. Right? So you have this shift from the ideological motivations towards more economic ones. And they develop these niche markets. And you have varying levels of legal and extra legal or illegal activities going on. And these bars that are engaging in some of these types of activities, it's lucrative, so gangs are there. They want to be able to earn some type of rent. If they can establish their control in that area, then they can start their own protection rackets, and the bars will pay them a certain percentage for a protection fee. And these gangs do provide protection.
But there's also, sorry, you touched on it just a second earlier, and I think I might get you to come back to a little bit here, because it's such a broad scope, this. So in 1986, it's the Asian Games. In 1988, Korea has the Summer Olympics, and the gangs begin to play a much larger role beyond the smaller crime on the streets. They began to play a role in the broader, massive construction projects that are needed for this period.
Yeah, so you have these groups, and there's varying levels of cooperation, and in return for keeping violence low or keeping these types of activities constrained to one area, the state will allow them to operate, and that's for the most part was going on during the 70s, during the 80s. But then you had a shift back towards these more direct cooperative relationships, or more easy to observe relationships, and they happen to be in things like construction, forced evictions, removal of shanty towns, and that's really interesting. So you had the initial cooperative relationships under a logic of capacity. And now in the 80s and the 90s and to the present, the state has the capacity to remove squatters, to suppress labor protests, but they don't. Rather than utilizing these state sources, whether it's the police, and they had specialized riot police also, rather than using them or the military, they turn towards the private market again. And so that's what I found really puzzling, is why does the state, which has the capacity, choose instead to outsource?
All right, we'll come right to that, I promise you. So the very next question will be about that. But just before we jump on to why these states are outsourcing, because that is the fascinating part, and you have some real interesting personal stories about this. Just to take one quick step back before we get there, tell us about Little Chun. So this is Chun Do-won, the president at the time, his brother, and he becomes, in a sense, an organized crime figure.
Yeah, so that's an interesting fact of Korea, or Korean culture, which facilitated my research, and is that there's this joke in Korean. They say "건달 모르는 사람 없다," which is there's no one in Korea who doesn't know a gangster. And that's in a way that's facilitated by these different types of relationships, whether it's family relationships or school ties or military ties or regional ties, and you have all these connections all the way from the bottom all the way to the top. And you had Chun Do-hwan, who's the president, and you had his younger brother, who was involved in less political activities and more sports activities and judo and taekwondo, and they were useful. So you have the president and his younger brother, and his younger brother is connected to sports, which is oftentimes connected to organized crime. and you have these relationships, and oftentimes they're utilized.
So let's wind forward here. And we'll get to that question right now. That question of why does a state that can or has the capacity to enforce certain laws or do certain things, why would it outsource in a way these things to a mafia group? So let's move forward to May 2011 and to a personal experience of yours. So you're on the street in Insadong. So take us there.
Well, if you have in Insadong is a historic district. It's a tourist. Some might call it trap. Other people might just call it just a tourist district. And you have these street vendors, and they are, of course, they're on the street, and they're selling oftentimes the same goods as the stores that are located there. Some people say they're a nuisance, that they're crowding the street. They're not paying taxes for the most part to the state, and they're in competition with these businesses that are paying really high rents and really high taxes. So the business association there wants them removed, and some might view them as kind of an eyesore. I think it gives Insadong a little bit more character, but that's my opinion.
No, I actually agree with you there. It actually improves the place. But so let's take us back there now. So you're on Insadong, you're on this street, which of course is a huge tourist street. It's absolutely crowded. There's no way this place is not going to be full of people. And on either side of the street are a line of police officers.
Yeah. So I went there. I showed up, and you had the street vendors, about 70 or so street vendors, and they have their street carts, their push carts, and they all have these red bands. On headbands on their head, and so they know that there's going to be a removal action taking place, which is kind of interesting. Why they know that, and on each side of this street are buses, and in the buses and right around the buses are these basically young thugs, both male and female, in their 20s. And they have these yellow vests and Insadong removal on them, and they're sitting around, and then they start going from one side of the Insadong street to the other, from one end to the other, and they go street vendor to street vendor, and they destroy their carts. And the street vendors are not passive; they're fighting. They're organized as well, and so it's this kind of chaotic instances of violence, and again it was really puzzling because you had the police, and this was going on for a number of weeks, but you had the police on one side, all clad in their riot gear, and they were just watching and allowing this to occur, which was really puzzling. And so later on I found out, of course, that the police are there to facilitate this and to prevent violence from spilling out into the businesses or getting too much out of hand.
So that might bring us to the question here. Why is this outsourced at all? And I thought it sort of touches on what you mentioned there, that all these sellers were wearing the red headbands. Yeah,
so you have these street vendors, and what they're trying to do actually, and this is not just with respect to street vendors, this is also with dealing with things like forced eviction or labor protest, is they're trying to escalate the level of violence. And that's kind of interesting. Why would they try to escalate the level of violence? Well, they actually want the police to get involved. And so why is it that they want the police to get involved? Well, when the police get involved and then society starts to pay attention, and when they see the police and they're involved in any kind of violent action, that has some kind of symbolic valence. So you have the middle class who is on, for the most part, you have the middle class, and they might benefit from having a more gentrified city, or having greater access to better infrastructure, or greater access to better, cleaner, safer apartments. But then they also played a significant role, the middle class, in democratization. And so when violence escalates, beyond the threshold, then they'll start paying attention. Then they'll start getting involved. Then things will have to change. And so that's the mechanism right there. Part of that is Korea specific. Is you have the state utilizing these non-state groups, these thugs, what are called Yongnyeok Kwesa, as a way to get around being punished by society.
So it's a way, in a sense, for them to commit, or not commit's the wrong word, to take certain policy actions and take certain unpleasant things that you have to do inside society occasionally, but also not suffer the costs that come along with those things.
Yeah, to distance themselves from actions that are deemed potentially illiberal.
And of course, just you mentioned that, of course, this is going to be very interesting for some listeners here, that it all sounds very, very organized. So you mentioned that the mafia, the thugs, the people running down the streets that are assaulting these people and smashing up market stalls are all wearing the same monochromatic yellow vests.
Yeah, so it's quasi. So the contracts, and this is the case in Sadong where I was able to get this. So there's explicit contracting by the state, by the Jongnugu office, and these Yongnyeok Kwesa saying, so here's basically the dates that you're going to do this, here's what they expect them to do. So that is completely explicit. We're not talking about implicit cooperation. And the contracts that they sign are legal. The actions, though, are illegal, and it's violence against the citizens that the state is supposed to protect. But of course, we're looking at street vendors, or we're looking at squatters in the case of forced evictions, and those would be considered perhaps vulnerable citizens, or citizens that don't have equal access to the democratic institutions that Korea has now. And so you have, in one sense, the middle class, which is benefiting from these public goods, but also being the ones that are also potentially will punish the state for those unpopular or undemocratic actions. And so one way around that is to utilize these thugs, these organized criminal elements.
Now, as important as that action is for these groups, no doubt, it sounds almost like they're being squeezed here. That as the state has got stronger and stronger, the actual avenues for their own criminality may be getting squeezed. So the idea of breaking up market stalls may not be the dream of most mafia groups. So just give us a brief overview of has that happened, has it not happened, and what do these mafia groups actually do this in modern day Korea? How do they make money? How do they operate? In what areas?
Well, absolutely. So in the case of Korea, in the case of Japan, you have lots and lots of there's debate on the definition of victim-based crime or victimless crime, but essentially crime where there's willing supply and willing demand. So there's lots and lots of those types of activities, but there's very little actual predatory crime, right? So you have a very high level of organized illegal activities, and the end result is that you have things, you can walk around in Korea at 2 or 3 a.m., the same in Japan, and things are very safe. The probability of getting attacked or getting robbed is lower here than it is in many parts of the United States. Certainly, I did my PhD in Ann Arbor, and Ann Arbor is in Michigan, is a very safe, nice place, but if you go 45 minutes away towards Detroit, things start getting a little bit more dangerous. So in Detroit, you have lots and lots of disorganized, unpredictable crime. In the case of Korea, you have the state which has achieved a certain amount of power where they can begin to control these groups and dictate where the state is and where the state isn't, and how these organizations operate. So it's organized crime as opposed to disorganized crime.
So on that point there about disorganized crime, has part of this removal of disorganized crime, has that come about through the police or through the mafia groups themselves? Because you'll often see people of an older generation. I think my grandparents themselves, growing up in London, were they used to reminisce about the Cray brothers, these two mafia thugs, and they would say things like, they were a bit violent, but they cleaned the streets up. They made people behave better. And are these mafia groups inside Korea cleaning the streets themselves, or is this a job just for the police?
Oh, it's both. It goes hand in hand. And one of the things that social scientists might assume is about human nature is people do what they do usually because they have to, or in somehow they believe that it's better for them, almost like a kind of a Richard or a Dawkins kind of the selfish type of gene. So why are these groups policing themselves? Well, because it's good for them. If they don't, then the police might find some other non-state group to tolerate, and so you have these different types of interactions going on, and the mafia type groups, they oftentimes have a lot easier job in inducing certain types of behavior that they want from these younger or unorganized groups.
Go.
But one of the key things is a lot of these younger thugs, they eventually want to be able to get in to the ranks of these kind of higher echelon groups. And the other thing is that a mafia type group doesn't have to worry about due process in terms of punishment. And if you have a group of thugs show up and they have baseball bats or axes or whatever it is that they have, that threat of violence is fairly credible, as opposed to the police and they have to investigate. So the police now operate under a democracy, and so what they can do now is much less than they could do in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which is kind of one of the. I asked one police officer who was a police officer during the early 80s, and I asked him, so why weren't these explicit relationships occurring as much? Why aren't they occurring now? Or why weren't they occurring then as they are now to the same extent? And he told me, well, at that time we were the mafia. They were the thugs. They didn't have to worry about democratic measures or repercussions. So it's kind of that also explains some of the causality there.
And just as we push on a little bit there, you mentioned the structures themselves, the hierarchies within these organizations. So let's move into that. Yeah. And they have a sort of an inverse idea of what most people's idea of a mafia organization is, at least traditionally based on the Sicilian mafia or the American mafia.
Yeah, so part of that is also a bit of a misconception, having these huge monolithic groups as opposed to a lot smaller. But certainly in Japan, you'll have groups like Yamaguchi-gumi, where they have continuity over time, or maybe the Five Families in New York. And it's kind of like a pyramid. So you have all these rents going up, and that itself is a protection racket. And so people down below, they're making money, and it goes up to the top. As opposed to, for the most part, there are some exceptions, but for the most part in Korea, money is going top down. So you gravitate towards the boss, which can provide money-making opportunities. And which bosses have the most power? Well, the ones that have the most connections, whether it's to the prosecutors or to the police or to various political actors or major businesses. And the money is going down as opposed to up. And so if you are a wealthy boss or you're well connected, then you have lots of money making opportunities. In Busan, there's a number of there's about 4 groups, all called Chilsungpa. There are Chilsungpa Haeundae and others. And those I've been told, and I've dealt with them less, but I've been told that they're much more like kind of a Japanese or a Sicilian model. But for the most part, these groups are they have continuity, but the names don't, and locations, of course, change, and they're much more fragmented and fluid. At least for the ones that I, for the most part, dealt with.
So if it is fragmented and fluid, at least in places like Seoul, as you mentioned there, and if all the money flows down from the top, so people at the bottom are effectively being paid a salary rather than earning their own money and then paying up a certain amount of rent or tax to the top, if this is happening, would this also imply these groups are maybe a bit more loose, that they change over time, that in that individual at the bottom who's not being paid enough might leave that organization for another one more readily than the other way around?
Yeah, so that happens. Groups come up and then they go down, and some groups their success depends upon the the political regime, whether it's from the southwest or the southeast. So whether it's Chollado or Gyeongsangdo, that often determines how well they are doing, and so it makes it more difficult to study. And the control is also a lot higher. The policing is a lot higher than in Japan. So in Japan, you do have continuity, and technically it's not illegal to be a member of Yamaguchi-gumi, and so you can study it. In Korea, it's much more difficult.
So let's touch on that for a second. It is much more difficult to be part of a criminal organization in Korea. There are laws on the books that even if you're a member, there's a certain amount of mandatory sentencing that goes on here, and you're in prison for what, between 2 to 10 years, depending on your rank inside the organization, just for being a member.
Yeah, I haven't looked at the laws recently. My research has kind of gone on to different areas, but for the most part, the state in Korea has a lot of leverage, and that those laws are not utilized across the board. Of course, they're utilized in very specific times. So that's the state just has more tools to get people to do what they want them to do. So they're used selectively.
So before we get back to another one of your personal experiences with inside this group here, you mentioned earlier that famous quotation that everyone inside Korea knows a mafia. So how likely is it for the average person who's just living inside Korea, who's walking the streets, who's living a normal life, to interact with these groups and maybe not even realize they're doing it? Of course, it used to be the case that tattoos used to be signs of this sort of criminality, but tattoos are now quite common inside Korea. So how likely it is for the average person to interact, whether knowingly or unknowingly, with mafia groups?
Well, I think it's highly likely. So I was able to get a really good data from a study done in 2006, an internal study by the prosecutor's office. And so this is an internal study. It was not for publication, and I was able to get my hands on it. And I also have that on my website, and they list in 2006 about 47,000 members throughout Korea. So as a percentage of society, it's higher in Korea than it is in Japan. So I think it's highly likely, and there's a lot of those. You do come across a lot of people that are. I wouldn't say wannabe gangsters, or some kind of like fake gangsters, or those that are overstating some of their activities or experience. So you do come across that, but it's a fairly high percentage that have been involved in some way, and certainly if you haven't met someone, you've met people that have. Through all these different connections.
Now, you have quite a remarkable experience inside these groups. So for the last few minutes here, we might walk through your own personal experience here. So you spent a year of your life living and breathing with these people. Now, of course, you managed quite to get in with the group, and then it must have been a very challenging time here. But my reading of some of the experiences you had here. So tell us about the moment with the karaoke bar when you're asked to throw the ice water over this singer, and also touch on the idea that when I was reading these stories, you can dismiss them as being, that sounds almost funny or trivial. But I got this sense that it must have been an incredibly paranoid year of your life. You must have been actually on edge most of the time.
Yeah. So in some of my background, so I from 6 years old, I was involved in taekwondo. That's one of the other reasons why I got interested in Korea. And in taekwondo, in martial arts, in sports, it's kind of a hyper masculine environment, and so I have been somewhat used to it before, how to deal with these guys, those types of personalities. But it certainly was stressful. And in one case, a lot of it seems somewhat banal or innocuous, I guess. So we were at a norebang, a karaoke, and we were sitting there, and I think I was actually misquoted in one, or I misspoke in one of the newspaper articles that was written about my work, but it wasn't an ice bucket. It was just bottles of water, and so we're sitting around in a very high class drinking establishment, which they all have the norebangs, and some of these guys were started to spray each other with the bottles of water, and also splash drinks and whiskey and so on. And there was one guy, and he was singing, and this guy was based in Seoul, but a member of Choesungpa, very violent. He was an individual that didn't like me, and he wasn't afraid to express that. Asking me, so why are you here? What are you doing? You're annoying, and so I was already not on his good side. Okay. And I could see how people kind of dealt with him with kind of kid gloves and making sure they didn't insult him. And he was up there singing. And the guy that was sitting next to me, so in Korea, the people that I was dealing with, they were all older than me. In Korea, is very hierarchical. So he would be considered my senior. And he told me to spray that kunda who was up there singing with that bottle of water. And he's telling me to do this. And if I disobey him, I'm going to insult this guy that's sitting next to me that's ordering me to do this, to basically commit suicide, or at least that's how it felt I would what I would be doing. And of course, my other option was to dump the water on the singer and then get killed subsequently by him. And so what I did is I just got the bottle of water and I made like I was going to spray the singer, and instead I just dumped it on my head, and everyone thought that was funny. And but I think I lost at least a couple of weeks off of my life just on those kind of things. And the other thing is how to get out of those situations, and how to explain yourself in a language that you're not native in. And so I can speak Korean. It's getting worse since I've been away from Korea, but I can get around. But that's still is stressful. So how do you deal with that? But I had some experiences before, and there was lots of other cases like that where telling me about doing cocaine or drugs or those kind of things. And oftentimes they were pushing me and testing me and seeing what I would do, and just messing with me because of course I'm the most junior person there, and so it was fairly stressful, and also how to deal with this also when you had a very high level of alcohol in your system. So how to maintain, in Korean they say judo. So not judo as in the Japanese martial art, but ju as in soju, mekju, yangju, and the alcohol, and do meaning do, the way. So the way of drinking alcohol. How do you maintain yourself? How do you continue to drink and not get drunk, essentially?
Yeah. And as a final question here, now this is a bit of a tricky question, but I'll throw it your way here. Now, we've spoken a lot about the different relationships and how they've changed through time. So their links to business, to politicians, to prosecutors, to police, and their role inside the society, whether it's a large role in state building or a much more minor role. So how do you see the future of the Korean mafia? Do you think it's going to get squeezed even smaller? Or do you think that this is going to be a niche there for them into the future?
Well, of course, the success or failure of any of these operations depends upon, in part, the state, and so what the state says, and so where they say these activities are okay, and it also depends upon demand, and there's demand for things like prostitution or entertainment. there's demand for other types of illegal activities. And oftentimes I think that the state has taken the approach that they would prefer organized crime as opposed to disorganized crime. And so where they allow it, of course, is very selective. So I assume that these types of organizations, I mean, it's never going to be, perfectly eradicated, and it can't be perfectly eradicated. But their influence on society has declined over time.
And you think it's going to continue to decline, or you think it's going to be it's stable, so to speak?
It's fairly stable right now, and like I mentioned a little bit ago, a lot of times the success or failure of these organizations depends upon the administration. Well, so what region, what party are they from?
So as long as they have those political connections, there's always going to be a period in time in which they're going to have enough favor and enough support through their on the street campaigning that they will have a place for them as long as the political parties allow it.
Yeah, exactly. And you do see over time, and I'm very thankful for this, because Korea is, for the most part, safe. Is you have very low levels of predatory crime. So those levels are it's big news if that is brought to light. And the state, essentially, they cannot perfectly police. They cannot be everywhere at all times, and so they're very much selective. So selective enforcement has diminishing returns. So it's easy to go from 190 to 80 to 70, and when you start getting lower and lower and lower, it gets harder and harder and harder. And so they make these decisions. Well, cocaine is bad, but maybe other types of drugs are okay, or this type of prostitution is not acceptable. But this one, where it's behind closed doors or is not utilizing Korean citizens, is. And so you see this for the most part, and the state really does have a high level of capacity, and they very much are subservient to whether it's the prosecutors or the police or the political actors.
So on that note, we might end this. It's been absolutely fascinating discussion so far, and I'll attach a link to this podcast for people that want to go and have a look at Jonson Porteux's work, and that's www.porteux.org, and that's Porteux. So Jonson Porteux, thanks for coming on the Korean Hour podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was fun.